There is a particular kind of story that gets told about the open road, and it almost always involves a van or a converted bus or a rebuilt camper, and it almost always involves a young person with good teeth and a camera, and it almost always takes place somewhere photogenic, a coastal cliff or a mountain meadow or a canyon rim at golden hour, and it always presents the life inside that vehicle as a kind of answer. An answer to overpriced cities and unfulfilling jobs and the tyranny of schedules and the vague feeling that something has gone wrong with the arrangement modern life expects you to accept. These videos get millions of views. They get sponsored by coffee brands and outdoor apparel companies. They generate comment sections full of people typing variations of "this is the life" and "goals" and "how do I start?" And they have almost nothing in common with what it actually looks like when a person without options ends up living in an RV because there is nowhere else to go and they need to figure out how to survive in it before the next cold front arrives. Dale Simmons had seen some of those videos. He'd had internet access at the library in Brawley, California, in the weeks before he made the decision that brought him out to the edge of the Salton Sea and eventually by stages to the strange patchwork territory south of Nyland that most people know as Slab City. That was the spring of 2010, and Dale was 43 years old, and he had spent the previous 8 months following a path that took him from a 2-bedroom apartment in Fontana to a friend's couch in Hemet to a weekly motel on a state highway to a parking lot in Indio where he'd stayed 3 nights before a police officer explained the logistics of why that particular spot wasn't going to work long-term. He had a 1999 Jayco travel trailer that he'd bought for $1,100 from a private seller who'd disclosed its issues honestly and completely, and by the time Dale arrived at Slab City, he had verified all of those issues firsthand and discovered several additional ones the seller either hadn't noticed or hadn't thought worth mentioning. He parked on the southern edge of the slabs, in the area where the concrete foundations left behind when the military base was demolished in the late 1950s create a flat, grid-like geometry that gives the settlement its name. He turned off the truck he used to tow the trailer and sat for a while in the specific quiet of that place, which is its own kind of loud once you've been still long enough to hear it, wind moving through creosote, a generator somewhere to the north, the distant sound of someone's radio leaking country music into the afternoon. What he had in the trailer was a problem in multiple categories, and Dale had made a list of the categories and ranked them by urgency, which was the thing he did when things felt unmanageable. He was a list maker. He had been a list maker as a warehouse supervisor, as a husband, as the coach of his son's Little League team in years that felt very far away now, and he had found that even when the list couldn't solve the problem, having it in front of him on paper made the problem finite, and finite was better than the alternative. The list went like this. 1. The trailer's freshwater system had a crack in the holding tank that he'd patched twice already and would need a real repair before summer because the Salton Sea basin in summer reached temperatures that made the desert around Quartzsite look mild by comparison, and you did not want to be without reliable water storage there. 2. The LP regulator on the stove was inconsistent in a way that made cooking unreliable and, depending on whose assessment you trusted, a potential hazard. 3. The trailer's single axle had developed a wobble that was intermittent, but that Dale understood well enough to know was not going to remain intermittent. 4. The roof vent over the sleeping area had lost its crank mechanism and was now either fully open or fully closed, with no position in between, which was fine in the current weather, but would be a significant temperature regulation problem by June. 5. And this was the one Dale had put last on the list because it was the one he didn't want to look at directly. The list of his financial resources, which he had put on the back of the same page, was very short. Slab City had been there since the base was abandoned, and over the decades it had developed the kind of layered complexity that comes from a place existing outside normal institutional oversight for 60 years. There were people who had been there for 2 decades and had built structures of considerable ambition on the foundations, buildings with real walls and real roofs, and in some cases real gardens maintained with water hauled in by hand. There were people who arrived every winter and left every spring, seasonals who were not homeless in the technical sense, but who preferred the freedom and cost structure of Slab City to the alternatives, and there were people like Dale, who arrived without a plan beyond getting somewhere they could stop and think, and who stayed because moving required momentum they hadn't rebuilt yet. The man who walked over to Dale's trailer on the second day was named Vincent, and he was one of the long-term residents. Having arrived at the slabs in 2002 after a chain of events he summarized as the usual kind and never elaborated on further, Vincent had a permanent site on a large slab near the eastern edge, and he had built up around it over 8 years a setup that was impressive by any standard: a shade structure of steel pipe and shade cloth spanning the width of 2 parking spaces, a proper battery bank with real capacity, a gray water management system that ran into a planted bed of native shrubs rather than pooling on the ground, and a workspace equipped with tools organized with a precision that recalled the inside of a mechanic's bay. Vincent was a practical man of the kind that the desert attracts and keeps, and he had, over his years at the slabs, developed a somewhat comprehensive taxonomy of the mistakes that new arrivals made, which he did not usually share unprompted, but which, in Dale's case, he apparently decided to share. He pulled up a bucket, sat down on it about 10 feet from where Dale was working on the water tank patch, and said, without particular preamble, that there were a number of things people believed about this kind of living that were wrong, and that the being wrong about them cost people more than they expected. Dale looked up from the tank patch and said he was listening. Vincent said that the first thing people got wrong was the cost. Not the permit cost, not the space rental cost, those were genuinely low, but the maintenance cost. People arrived thinking that because they weren't paying rent, they were accumulating resources, and they were right in a narrow technical sense and catastrophically wrong in a practical sense, because an aging vehicle under full-time use in a desert environment degraded at a rate that no savings account at the margin could keep ahead of. You were not saving money, Vincent said. You were deferring costs, and deferred costs in an RV did not get smaller with time. They got larger and they arrived all at once. Dale asked what the second thing was. Vincent said the second thing was water. People understood intellectually that water was scarce and that hauling it was a logistical task, but they underestimated the actual daily quantity a person needed to maintain the minimum standard of cleanliness and hydration that kept them functional, and they overestimated how often they would feel like making the haul. The result was a consistent pattern. People rationed water in ways that accumulated into hygiene deficits and dehydration that degraded their thinking and their capacity, which then made every other problem harder to solve because they were solving it while mildly compromised. It was, Vincent said, a loop that was easy to enter and hard to exit because the degradation was gradual enough that you adjusted your expectations downward to match your capacity rather than recognizing the gap. Dale asked about the third thing. Vincent had a list of things, it turned out. The third thing was ventilation. The fourth thing was the social dynamics of a shared space and how different they were from the social dynamics of conventional living. The fifth thing was the particular psychological challenge of time without structure, which sounded like a relief until you had lived it for several weeks and discovered that the absence of imposed structure did not automatically produce genuine freedom but could instead produce a kind of gray drifting that was its own form of constraint. The sixth thing was the difference between what the vehicle looked like in the listing and what it was actually capable of sustaining, which was nearly always a significant gap. And the seventh thing, Vincent said, which he considered the most important, was the expectation about community. People arrived at places like Slab City imagining either that it would be hostile and dangerous, which it sometimes was in specific localized ways, but rarely in the general systemic way outsiders feared, or that it would be warm and communal and tribal in the way that appealed to people who had been lonely in cities. The truth was more complicated. It was a place that would give you exactly as much as you put into it and not a calorie more. And the relationships that formed here were built on utility and honesty in proportions that most people had been socialized to find uncomfortable. And if you couldn't make your peace with that, the place would feel cold in ways that had nothing to do with the temperature. If you're trying to sort out what's actually true about a situation like this, what the real priorities are when you're building a functional life from a vehicle with limited resources, there is a resource that exists precisely for that kind of orientation. The Crisis Craft Field Manual is in the link in the bio, and it approaches this from the same starting point Vincent was describing. Not the version of this life that gets filmed at golden hour, but the version that happens at noon in July when something has broken and you have $20 and 2 hours before it becomes a bigger problem. It's worth having before you need it. Dale thought about what Vincent had said for a long time after the man went back to his own site. He sat with his list, which suddenly seemed both more accurate and more incomplete, and he looked at the trailer, and then at the flat concrete, and then at the horizon, which in the Salton Sea basin has a particular hazed quality in warm weather, a kind of atmospheric uncertainty where the boundary between earth and sky is not entirely committed to being a line. And then he started working. The water tank was first. He had patched it twice with an epoxy compound that was adequate for minor repairs and inadequate for structural ones, and what the tank actually needed was a section replacement or a full replacement, neither of which he had the money for as a unit purchase. What he did instead was engineer a workaround that Vincent watched from a distance with what Dale would later describe as professional skepticism. He removed the cracked tank entirely and replaced its function with a 2-tank gravity system, a 40-gallon food-grade plastic drum he found at a feed store in Nyland for $14, and a 15-gallon supplemental drum he sourced from the same store, both suspended on a simple frame he welded together from angle iron he found in the metal pile at the east end of the slabs where people left materials they were done with. The gravity feed ran through a half-inch line with a ball valve shut-off into the trailer's existing plumbing at the point where the holding tank had connected, a splice that required about 40 minutes and 4 compression fittings from the Treen hardware store in Nyland. The total cost was under $30. What would you have done? Faced with a repair that your budget couldn't technically cover? There are ways to solve problems that don't start from having the right parts. They start from understanding what the part is actually doing, what function it serves in the system, and then asking whether that function could be served differently with what's available. It's the kind of thinking that formal training doesn't always develop, and that necessity develops very quickly. Leave a thought in the comments if you've ever had to engineer your way around a problem that was supposed to require something you didn't have. Vincent came over to look at the finished system. He walked around it, checked the fittings by hand, traced the plumbing with his eyes. He did not say anything complimentary. What he said was that the angle iron frame was going to need cross-bracing if the drums were going to stay stable when the trailer moved, and that he would have run the supply line on the other side to keep it out of the direct sun. Dale added the cross-bracing that afternoon and rerouted the supply line the next morning. Vincent came by again, looked at both modifications, said better, and left. The axle wobble was the problem that Dale had been avoiding looking at directly, partly because he had some intuition about what it was, and the intuition involved a bearing that had been running dry for longer than it should have, and a bearing that had been running dry for too long was either a cheap fix or a very expensive one, depending entirely on how much damage had accumulated while it ran dry and whether the damage was to the bearing alone or had worked its way into the hub. He pulled the wheel and drum and found that he had gotten lucky in the specific way that the mechanically attentive sometimes get lucky, which is that the damage had not yet propagated. The bearing was done, but the hub was fine. A replacement bearing from the parts store in Brawley cost $11. The job took 3 hours and required a bearing race driver that Dale improvised from a section of steel pipe and a flat washer, a tool that Vincent described as inelegant but functional, which Dale was beginning to understand was the highest compliment Vincent offered about anything. Over the weeks that followed, Dale worked through his list and in the process of working through it, learned something that the list had not contained and could not have, which was what it felt like to fix a thing and have it stay fixed, not in the temporary, duct tape and hope way that had characterized his first weeks in the trailer, but in the way that comes from understanding a problem well enough to address its actual cause rather than its symptoms. The LP regulator, when he finally got into it, turned out to have a diaphragm that had hardened with age. He sourced a replacement diaphragm from a supplier in Phoenix who sold them by mail for $3, followed a disassembly procedure he found in a service manual someone had left in the tool pile, and replaced the component in 40 minutes. The stove functioned reliably afterward. The roof vent was the last item on the list and the one Dale most enjoyed fixing, partly because it required fabrication. The original crank mechanism had sheared at its connection point, leaving a stub that was not long enough to get a grip on, but that was present enough to work with. Dale machined a new handle from a section of aluminum flat bar he found in the metal pile, drilling it to receive the stub and securing it with a crosspin he made from a nail, filed and fitted. It took 2 tries to get the geometry right, and the second try was correct. And when he cranked the vent to the midpoint position and it held there and didn't slip, he sat in the cab of his truck for a few minutes doing nothing, which was not something he had allowed himself much of since Fontana. The community at Slab City had its rhythms, and Dale found them gradually, the way you find the rhythms of any place that doesn't announce itself. The Saturday market, where people traded things they had for things they needed. The communal meals that happened twice a week at the outdoor kitchen someone had built from scavenged restaurant equipment. The evening gatherings at the range, the outdoor performance space on the edge of the settlement where people played music and told stories and sat in folding chairs watching the desert sky go dark through every color it knew. These things were not organized by anyone and were not maintained by anything except the accumulated will of the people who showed up for them. And showing up for them was, Dale came to understand, the core of what made Slab City a place rather than a parking lot. Vincent came to the Saturday market and to the communal meals, though he ate quickly and left early and did not linger for the social parts. He had been living alone at the Slabs for 8 years and had equilibrated to it in ways that he was not unaware of and did not appear to consider problems exactly, though Dale had seen him once late on a Tuesday evening, sitting outside his shade structure looking at nothing with an expression that was difficult to interpret, but that Dale, who recognized certain things about certain expressions, did not want to intrude on. He thought about that expression sometimes over the summer, which arrived in the Salton Sea basin the way it always does, without negotiation, turning the temperature gauges to numbers that required verification because they looked too high to be real. Dale had prepared for it better than most first summer residents, primarily because Vincent had told him about the ventilation problem in April and he had taken it seriously. He'd installed 2 additional vents in the trailer's roof using a hole saw and salvaged vent covers from a demolition pile at the edge of the settlement, and he'd built a shade structure over the trailer using 40 feet of shade cloth and a framework of PVC pipe that Vincent had assessed as adequate for wind loading under 20 miles per hour, which covered most of the conditions they faced except for the storm events that came up from the Gulf of California in late summer, and bent things that you'd thought were fine. He was living by any conventional measure in conditions that most people would describe as hardship. He had no air conditioning, he had limited water, he had no fixed income, though he had found intermittent work in Nyland and Brawley doing mechanical repairs for people who'd heard from someone that there was a guy at the Slabs who was good with the practical problems that came with full-time vehicle dwelling. He had no real privacy from the community around him and limited control over the noise and the smells and the proximity of other people's difficulties, and he was, in a way he had not been in several years and had not expected to be again so soon, fine. Not happy in any uncomplicated way, not comfortable, but fine in the sense of functional, of being a person who understood their situation and was managing it deliberately, and who could, at the end of a given day, account for what they'd done with it. The lies that Vincent had described were real. The cost problem was real. The water problem was real. The psychological challenge of unstructured time was real, though Dale had found that he was less susceptible to it than some people he'd seen arrive and drift, perhaps because the list-making habit gave him a structure that lived inside him rather than requiring external imposition. The social dynamics of a shared space were genuinely different and genuinely challenging, particularly in the high summer when the population thinned to the people who couldn't or wouldn't leave, and the heat made everyone slightly shorter of patience. The gap between the listing and the reality had been exactly as wide as Vincent had promised. But the 2 things Vincent had flagged as most important, the cost problem and the community problem, had turned out to be addressable in ways that required understanding rather than money. You could outpace the cost problem by developing the skills to maintain what you had, by learning the difference between a problem that required a new part and a problem that required understanding what the part was doing, by building the kind of practical vocabulary that lets you look at a failing system and see not an expense but a question with a findable answer. And the community problem, the one about utility and honesty in uncomfortable proportions, was actually not a problem at all once you stopped expecting the community to perform warmth it didn't feel and started recognizing the value of the thing it actually offered, which was straightforward information, freely given, with no agenda beyond the mutual interest in things working. Dale stayed at Slab City through that summer and the winter that followed and the summer after that. He left for short stretches for work, for logistics, once to see his son in Sacramento for a long weekend that was awkward in ways that were not entirely anyone's fault. But he came back, each time to the flat concrete grid and the strange sky and the familiar sounds of generators and wind and music from the range drifting across the desert in the evening. He was still there in 2012 when a woman arrived with a completely seized water pump and a look on her face that Dale Recognized from the way he imagined his own face had looked in that first week, the look of someone who has arrived at the end of a path and is not sure there is a next one. He walked over to her trailer, looked at the pump, asked a few questions, and told her it was fixable. She looked at him with an expression that contained skepticism and something that might have been relief, and he got his tools from the organized tray in his workshop and got to work. To everyone who stayed for this one, the real story of this kind of living is not in the lies or in the mythology. It's in the specific, unremarkable, accumulating work of solving the problems that actually exist in front of you, one at a time, with what you have, for as long as it takes. That's the whole of it. There's another story on the channel that comes at this from a different direction, from a different place and a different person, and if this one meant something to you, that one will too. Go find it. You've earned it.